Hey everybody, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to the Tone Engineer. Today we are exploring some of the most iconic tones of the Randall RG100, made famous by the equally legendary riff lords such as Eyehategod and Superjoint Ritual's Jimmy Bower, Crowbar's Kirk, and of course the one and only Pantera's Dimebag Daryl. I hate even wasting time saying what I'm about to say, but I unfortunately feel that it's kind of necessary in this case, as this video series tends to garner more outside attention than some of the stuff I typically make, which I'm grateful for, but I'm more grateful for having a recurring subscriber base and audience that gets what I do and seemingly are more level-headed than a lot of the YouTube comment sections out there, so thank you for that. You don't know how much that means. But some of the bands that are going to come up in conversation today have garnered controversy in the past due to lyrical content, choices of language, and imagery. And I just want to say I'm here to talk about guitar tones. That's it. That's all I care about is gear and riffs, and I have no interest in going any further than that. For example, I made a Behemoth cover, a few years ago. I don't worship Satan, but I appreciate their music. I can make that disconnect. If you cannot make that disconnection from the art versus the artist, if you're hung up about some specific imagery or choice of language and you feel that it's necessary to write a novel in the comment section, how about just go watch something else and let's save each other, wasted breath on that topic. So with that out of the way, let's talk about what I actually want to when it comes to the Tone Engineer, which is, as you might imagine, the tones. It's been a couple years since the last time we've seriously explored the Randall RG100, and the tones that came out of that video were more on the classic rock to hard rock, approaching thrash metal area of sounds, by my book at least. And even one commenter pointed out, saying, this is exactly what this amp sounds like in the room. Like, this is the closest approximation, best representation of this amp that I've ever heard on YouTube, because most people have to go to extreme measures to get a lot of the recorded sounds that we think of when we think Randall RG, especially because of Dimebag. This is not a Dimebag machine. You have to do a lot to it to get that iconic tone. We're certainly going to talk about that today. Let's cover a few of the common threads before we jump into specifics about each individual rig here. With the amplifier, we're going to be on the red channel exclusively. The green channel is kind of like your plexi low input. You can actually mix them, which is kind of interesting, but we're going to be only using the high gain channel going into the high +6 dB input for the music we're playing today. We want all the boost that we can get out of this thing. Master volume, though on recording, I have read that especially at least one of these bands probably played on higher master volumes than I am today. I have also read that Dimebag shared my disdain for this amplifier past about 10, 11 o'clock because it starts to get a little weird in the power amp. I don't know if it's something to do with the transistor saturating and kind of sounding boxy, but I'm not big on it. And even hitting the diaphragm of a dynamic microphone, I prefer it around this region and definitely no further than noon. So you're going to see that for the master volume basically the entire time. What you're also going to see almost the entire time is the gain pot either, 8, 9, most of the time maxed out. Again, with the sounds we're chasing today, we want to brutalize this amplifier with as much distortion and input level as humanly possible. The tone stack's going to change a little bit, but you're going to notice that for the most part, I want to have quite a bit of bass dialed in, and mids and treble are really going to shape the mids and high mids, depending on which band we're taking a look at. Reverb, 0, don't want that for hard rock and sludge metal. And then presence, again, is one of those fundamental controls that we're going to take advantage of on this amplifier. For 2 of the artists, I am using the matching Randall 4x12. This model actually has the Celestian creambacks in it, but for a lot of Dimebag's iconic tones, and I would assume for a lot of the stuff Crowbar was doing, they were using the Randall Jaguar speakers, which I do not have, but as you'll probably hear on recording with the way we're approaching this, it's not going to make the biggest difference in the world, and you can certainly compensate for it later. I think in the brief encounters I've had with some of those cabinets, this sounds a little creamier, a little more balanced, less fizzy in the room, which is something you might expect from something like a creamback style speaker. Sits somewhere between like a T75 and V30. But again, with what we're doing in the recording signal chain, not really going to be a big deal. Let's kick this thing off by starting with Dimebag Daryl, though this section feels a little superfluous to me with Ola England's dozens of Dimebag's videos in existence. He's done such a great job of cataloging a lot of those tones. I mean, he's talked to his guitar tech, he's been to the estate. Like, I wish he'd just make a full-length feature, like documentary about all those things. But I will add what I can, I suppose, to all the stuff that he's covered in great detail. Most of the stuff you see sitting up here is for the Dimebag signal chain, although not every piece is exactly what he would have used. I think we're going to get a pretty similar result at the end. Let's start with the guitars, of course. Dime, of course, made the Dean ML infamous with his custom-painted Dean from Hell. He used a Bill Lawrence L500XL pickup in the bridge position with the hot rail flipped around, pointed towards the neck, which I think contributed to a lot of that vocal honky sound that you hear out of the big 4 Pantera albums. And it's one that I certainly tried to emulate in the guitar choices. Funny enough, this guitar that I painted up for a Dimebag costume a few years ago, and the red beard and all, I only used on one song for the D standard tuning, and with all of the Pantera stuff, it's actually halfway between whatever key they're playing in and the next step down. I can't remember exactly what that translates to in tuning, but on a standard tuner, just tune it to where you're flickering between, like, the high line on D sharp and the low line on E flat, or for D, the same thing. But guitars generally look like this, and of course, Kirk also for a long time favored the Dean MLs as well. But the guitar that I used mostly for the Dimebag stuff is my Jackson RR3 with EMG Hertz pickups. These are still passives, which I think does fit the Dimebag spirit. The higher output here certainly doesn't hurt for this material, and I also feel that there's, well, some feel impact from playing with this Floyd Rose tremolo and locking nut. Maybe not so much on the tonal contribution side of things, but, whatever little piece of the puzzle fits, it helps for me. Now, between Cowboys from Hell and his untimely death, Dimebag had several variations for his rhythm rig, but the general layout was pretty much the same every time. It was graphic EQ into parametric EQ into whatever amplifier he was using, into whatever cabinet he was using. Kind of that same workflow every time. He would switch out the parametric equalizer and even the amplifier from time to time, go back and forth between them. According to some interviews, tour with some, record with others. But I think the rig that we have right now is versatile enough to cover all of the big 4 of the Pantera albums. But ultimately, don't sweat it if you don't have the exact same kind of graphic EQ or the exact same kind of parametric EQ. A lot of this stuff can be made up for throughout the signal chain, and these are more level contributors than they are, you know, a fundamental part of the distortion texture, which I think is more important. We're going to skip over this guy for now. We'll get back to that here in a second. And we'll start our tonal shaping with the MXR 6-band, the old classic blue box here. I've seen a lot of V shapes or upside down V shapes, which I'm sure works for a lot of guitars and sounds fine. And he probably even recorded or toured with that a lot of times, because once you start boosting 3.2K, you can get some nasty stuff on some guitars. But from a lot of the diagrams I've seen, and even a lot of the amplitude presets that come with the Dimebag Daryl signature pack, this is kind of the shape you see. Now again, depending on your guitar, you might want to tweak just to get the voicing more close to what you hear on album, but this is what I'm going to use for the entire run of Pantera riffs you hear. Then that goes into the Furman PEQ3. He did use the PQ4 at times. What is ultimately accomplished here is an overall level boost and then a 2 to 3 decibel boost on specific frequencies. For the high band, it's around 4K, a little bit more, according to some of the stuff I've read, around 900 to 920 for the mid band and like 150, 160 for the low band. All the bandwidths are set to fairly broad, not quite max on here, about 8 out of 10 notches on the mid and high band, and close to 7 out of 10 here. You don't want, you know, like a GEQ, you don't want those really tight octave filters here. We're going for kind of broad shaping on the PEQ. So if you have a 3-band, 4-band, whatever that can accomplish the same thing, you're good. Use that. Don't pay $400 for one of these things. Huge shout out once again to Keith from the Gearland for loaning me this thing so I can make this video, because the used market right now is kind of nuts on anything Furman. So if you really have to have something with red knobs or blue knobs for the other model and it works exactly the same way, then I would take a look at some of the pedals that mimic this thing. This, of course, boosts the Randall RG100, which, as I said in the Gear Curiosities on this is not a hot rod amplifier, really. I mean, in the context of the time that it was released, sure, it does even have kind of a Jose mod pull where you engage some additional clipping diodes, and the overall architecture is very JCM 800 with transistors. But out of the box, it doesn't do Pantera. So Dimebag was kind of doing this really contemporary boost methodology that a lot of us guitarists use now, which is kind of crazy. I mean, they had already figured out, you know, the Boss Super Overdrive and Rats and SD1s into Marshall kind of things, but it's a very different tone and texture. And yet Dime was out there using boosts and preamps and equalizations in ways that pedal companies didn't figure out for another 25 years. So pretty insane stuff. For the Randall settings, again, gain maxed, master below noon. And the EQ gets really important here, because if you set everything at noon, kind of the Marshall way, you're going to get a Marshall-y sound. It's going to be very mid-focused and kind of honky, and that's not Dime. So again, we're going to turn bass fairly high, you know, 7-ish. When I say 7, not 7 o'clock, 7, you know, 5, 6, 7. And then the mids between 3 and 4, generally what I found worked best. I think this is really going to depend on your microphone position and your cabinet choice. Treble, this one's interesting. Around 3 to 4, favoring closer to 4. Treble is kind of a high mids centric sound on a lot of Marshall style tone stacks. So when you hear the recorded tone, it kind of makes sense. And then we're going to make up for that with presence cranked. Anywhere between like 7, 8, and 9. And that introduces a lot of that 4 to 6,000 hertz fizz, frankly, but it works by the time you balance out all the other equalization, and especially when you chuck everyone's favorite SM57 up to the dust cap on this. Yeah, it's a little stereotypical, but it works. And that is really the defining Dimebag kind of microphone sound. And in fact, that is the only microphone I want to use throughout this entire video. Doesn't really fit the aesthetic of, you know, blue collar sludge metal to have 4 different microphones set up on a cabinet anyway. And it actually works tonally. The microphone was very much used as a fine-tuned EQ in this video. You'll see when I move it. I was very intentional on where exactly I was aiming it at the dust cap, if it was at the cap edge or what angle it was looking at, because I was not touching the EQ anywhere else on this amplifier. Just slamming into the front of that diaphragm and getting that nice fizzy hi-fi 90 sound that resulted in. There's one more trick that we could have probably implemented in the effects loop if you really wanted it to be an all-in-one package. But going into the virtual console on Cubase, I also engaged a parametric EQ. He was known to use a 700 to 800 hertz scoop around like -4 dB. And then about a 5,000 hertz presence boost, which I use as a shelf. And that really brought the whole thing together. Again, you can do kind of a high pass, low pass at your typical 60-ish and 10,000 to even take it out to like 15K on this amplifier. And I mean, that's more or less the recorded Dimebag sound when it comes to a single track guitar. But he had another trick up his sleeve, especially for live use, because he was the only guitarist in Pantera, but he would even mix this effect in under his main amplifier in a lot of the recordings. I'm, of course, talking about the MXR Flanger Doubler, another sought-after, really expensive legacy piece of gear that can either do flanger sounds, as you would expect, but it can also take that pitch-modulated dynamic delay line and mix it in as a doubler to kind of sound like a double tracker. Well, wouldn't you know it, I don't have that, but I do have the TC Electronic Mimic, which we covered a few years ago, and it's a double tracker too. You plug it before all of your other equipment, and you can actually put stuff before and after it, but it essentially does the same thing. It pitch modulates a dynamically delayed line, and ran in stereo, it sounds so close to real double tracking that you can really not even tell unless someone tells you. What I can hear is the stereo image just isn't quite as wide. So what you'll hear on recording is one pass of the clean signal, kind of panned left about 70%, and then one pass of this set to max effect, about center on the tightness, and one overdub and sent to the right side about 70%. So there is a little overlap in the center channel, and it sounds a lot more like what you might hear coming through the PA at a live Pantera concert back in the day, and especially on some of the early recordings. I would love to have the doubler for this video, but it's just not happening, and this thing doesn't sound nearly as good in this effects loop. Some weird low pass stuff going on that I was not a fan of, but in front, it does the job. If Dimebag's guitar tone can be equated to a speeding supercar, then the next ones we're going to explore are more akin to a monster truck whose driver is stoned. But I guess all the guitarists in this video are stoned. There's a joke here somewhere. I'm not going to take the time to try to figure it out. Whatever the case, when it comes to Crowbar, Kirk has been over the years very fond of the Randall RG series himself. He's been flirting more with the orange crushes, I think, in Down and in Crowbar, but you know, you can kind of get similar sounds out of him anyway. What his big secret ingredient has been, though, besides low tunings and playing some absolutely monstrous riffs, is the Boss Metal Zone, no less. And I know some people are going to be like, oh my God, you know, Boss Metal Zone memes. But thankfully, he doesn't use it in the typical 12-year-old at Guitar Center setup with distortion at maxed and mid scooped and highs and low. No, not that at all. Actually, what he does is keeps the entire EQ tone stack at noon, keeps distortion rolled all the way off and level at maximum. And you basically have this kind of almost no distortion. It does have a little bit of granularity and compression to it because there's a lot of gain stages in this thing. But for the most part, it's another clean preamp, just in the same way that Dimebag used in front of this amp. So they're going about it very different ways, and you do get a different result, different texture. But it's interesting to see two artists that are kind of, you know, within the same realm of Southern metal to an extent, yet they're going after their supercharged guitar tones and fundamentally the same kind of philosophy, just on different sides of the same coin. So I think this sounds amazing. I'm gonna have to try this in front of literally every amp I own. This plus a low-tuned, you know, B drop A shorter scale guitar just sounds absolutely immense through this amplifier. Now, the difference with this setup versus what like Dimebag would use, and I don't know this to be 100% the case with Kirk's actual setup, but to match what I was hearing on album, I had to take treble to about 6 or 7, tank the mids even more in some cases, keep the bass up, but really dial back the presence because you don't hear a lot of that higher end fizziness, which can almost make you mistake Kirk's sound for a tube amp. But it was dialed in such a way that it's just totally on a different level than what Dime was playing through. I, of course, if you didn't notice by now, am not using the Boss Metal Zone. I'm using the Behringer equivalent to boost this. But otherwise, same setup, same cabinet, and just kind of angling the SM57 a little differently to take away some of the high-end sizzle, especially for a lot of Crowbar's older work, and then repositioning it to get some more of that boomy proximity effect and some of the chunky high-end when necessary for more recent albums. Our last signal chain for the day is just about as straightforward as Kirk's, except basically every element but the amplifier is swapped out for an equal and opposite replacement. So I don't know with 100% confidence what Jimmy was using during the Superjoint ritual stuff, but he doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who's gear obsessed and could probably just make whatever's thrown at him sound like him, and everything he's ever been on, well, it sounds like Jimmy Bauer. So I'm going to assume that it's somewhere in the realm of what I'm about to show you. And it's relatively simple, and it's an absolute sludge machine. Again, it's one of those things where you listen to it without context. I don't think your first intuition is going to be, well, yeah, that's a Randall RG. It's kind of nuts. So he's been spotted touring with the rack mount HT version that Dimebag, of course, used several times, but this will, of course, cop the same sounds and has been spotted again in some of the music videos for Eyehategod and Superjoint Ritual. Jimmy boosts it with one pedal, the Boss Super Overdrive, of course, one of my favorite boosts ever, and in kind of a less than, I would say, tight configuration that we would normally do. I wasn't able to find any exact settings anywhere, but what I dialed in to taste looks very similar to a fan who took a picture of his pedal board on stage. So I'm going to go with something like this. And again, you can always play with it depending on your guitar and amp setup. SD1, yet another reason to own one of these horrendously underrated gems. Going into the Randall RG again, crank the gain. This is one of those tones that I think actually kind of works for a higher than noon master volume, but I couldn't stand it any higher sitting in this room than I had it. I would want to put this thing way away and run a microphone cable to it. But for what I was doing today, it still worked at around noon or a little bit below. This was one of those instances where I actually liked mids really high and to kind of do a Tony Iommi thing and push the power section of this amplifier with quite a bit more treble and mid content than we were doing on the previous tones. As a result, presence was dialed back quite a bit, if not all the way to 0 for some of this stuff. Since this is kind of a low, sludgy sound, it needs to be a little more lo-fi, a little fatter and round, and that definitely worked for that. The last ingredient to the changes here is a different cabinet entirely. And I'm sure this would sound fine and probably works even better for some of the earlier Superjoint Ritual stuff, but he's using Mesa oversized cabinets here recently with, of course, V30s, and that definitely was the ticket. It's, again, adds to that big low end and kind of smoother top end that you hear compared to Kirk and Dimebag sounds that we just heard. hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I did making it. I think the B-side for the Randall RG is going to be a lot of fun too, a little off the cuff, but very similar to the last stonery doom kind of thing. It'll kind of transition, I think, rather nicely into the next installment after that, whenever that is. Don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, but the scope changed a lot for this video as I did more research. Even while I was making the video, it changed a little bit, and I think it turned out better as a result. But there's so many unexplored ideas and untapped tones that I do want to get into on this channel. And this, I think, is just going to be another, kicking off point for. So excited about that. Just got to temper my expectations on when I do get to them. Got a lot to do for this channel. It's a good problem to have. Anyway, thanks so very much for watching. Any other questions or comments, leave them down below, or go ask Ola if it's about Dimebag, and we will see you next time. Bye.